so don't forget it.
It was never meant to be close. When Ted Heath lost the 1974 election, twice, the initial assumption was that he wouldn't be leader of the Conservative Party very much longer. But then the party took a look around themselves and discovered a surprising paucity of candidates. Hardy perennial Reginald Maudling was now well out of the picture, having resigned as Heath's Home Secretary over a relatively minor scandal and now slowly drinking himself to death. Rising star of the right and born-again neoliberal Keith Joseph was widely tipped, but he accidentally ruled himself out via a speech calling for poor and or stupid people to have fewer babies. He didn't actually mean to effectively support eugenics, more to point out the cycle of social deprivation and how it perpetuates itself. At least that was his excuse. But putting it in terms like our human stock is threatened didn't exactly do him any favours. Meanwhile, Willie Whitelaw, with the obsequiousness that was already his trademark, pledged his loyalty to Heath, and most of the now shadow cabinet did the same. It looked like the leadership election Heath had called would be, as he had intended, a coronation. Meaningless backbencher Hugh Fraser eventually threw his hat in, merely in the interest of making it a nominal contest, but even he knew that wasn't going to stop it from being a stroll. And then...
Be quiet, big boys don't cry. Big boys don't cry. Big boys don't cry. Big boys don't cry. Big boys don't cry.
One can never be sure of anything. We're all very much aware that when Mr. Heath and Mr. Maudling were contesting in 1965, what the papers said would happen was quite different from what did happen. So obviously things could...
Thatcher had been itching to join the fight from the start, but Keith Joseph got there first. He was her mentor, her guru. His inverted Damascene conversion to neoliberalism was the conception of what would become Thatcherism, of which Joseph would soon become one of the main architects. In all honesty, though, he was never really leadership material, and not just because he was inarticulate enough to call for the sterilisation of the underclass by mistake. Having done that, any potential campaign was dead on arrival, and when Joseph dropped out, it was the cue for Thatcher, one of the first people he informed, to jump in to represent the right of the party in his stead. Even then, nothing changed in the race at first. Heath himself was one of the first to be informed of Thatcher's challenge, personally by the challenger herself, and his response was to shrug and say, "If you must." The former Education Secretary against the leader of 10 years and Prime Minister for the previous 4. A man backed by the entire cabinet. Well, almost. I mean, sure, he was unpopular, but not to the point he'd lose to a nobody, let alone a female nobody. Alright, that's a bit strong. She was definitely a rising star, but one very much still in the process of rising. Thatcher at this point was basically known for milk snatching and failing to save the tripartite system. Not much of a legacy to build a leadership bid on. At best, the thinking was she might have given him a run, but surely she didn't have a shot at actually winning. None of the Tory-supporting papers, which at the time was almost all of them, gave her a chance, with the notable exception of the Spectator. Big deal. But as the campaign dragged on, an advantage started to make itself clear. The cabinet might have loved their boss, or at that point said they did, but the backbenches were sick of losing elections. Heath had lost 3 out of 4 in 8 years, and they were increasingly angry at the leftward drift of the party over his decade in charge. It had got to the point where by now you could see the centre for a good pair of binoculars. The hard right, effectively out in the cold since the days of Macmillan, had hardened still further into a new, brutal, flinty substance hitherto unknown in British politics, informed by the ideas of Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman.
Words are flowing out like endless rain into a paper cup. They slither wildly as they slip away.
The future they saw was one where profit was the greatest motivating force in the world. Everything from consumer goods to basic necessities of life was governed by its pursuit. Big business was free to do almost anything to achieve it, and government existed solely to keep order and preserve the glorious apparatus of capital. As for low-income people, well, they were happy running about in their hamster wheels all day, largely because of a vast unregulated media that told them they were happy to be running around in their hamster wheels all day, and bred out the ability to question its wisdom. Margaret Thatcher was part of the hard core of this black diamond, and ultimately it was she who took on the burden of bringing that utopian vision into existence. And it was a vision held by more of the party than Heath had counted on. Come the election itself, to the palpable shock of everyone in the world, except for Thatcher herself, of course, she came out ahead with 49% of the vote to Heath's 45%, with the remaining going to Fraser for shits and giggles. A horrified Heath saw the writing on the wall and stepped down in abject humiliation, beginning a professional seething career which would last the next 2 decades. But the rules at the time were that the winning candidate needed at least 15% of the vote, necessitating another contest. Thatcher was the only candidate to fight both rounds, Fraser having had his fun didn't bother, and with Heath now done and dusted, his loyalists, or supposed loyalists in the shadow cabinet, could show their true colours. Re-enter William Whitelaw, a huge Anglo-Scottish posh boy who always seemed to be scowling even when he was smiling, which wasn't often. He'd been the first Northern Ireland Secretary, a post created in the wake of Bloody Sunday, and then, briefly, the Employment Secretary. His public demeanour of an outsized bumbling Tory laird hid one of the wiliest and most ambitious politicians around at the time. He was Heath's closest ally and preferred successor, and from the moment his enormous frame entered the picture, was the favourite for the contest, Thatcher or no Thatcher. Also entering the ring was Sir Geoffrey Howe, then a relative newcomer who at that point had only held one government job, Solicitor General, which amounts to Deputy Attorney General and isn't a cabinet role. His entry into the contest was largely a PR exercise on his own behalf. It certainly got Thatcher to take notice of him. He would soon be a ubiquitous figure in her cabinet, serving there for all but 3 rather eventful weeks. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. With James Pryor and John Peyton pointlessly making up the numbers from the backbenches, round 2 was scheduled for just a week later. Quite refreshing in these days, when it takes months just to elect a deputy leader. This did, however, hand Thatcher the advantage of having had the extra time to impress everyone, and to demonstrate her tireless energy when it came to beating the shit out of anyone to the left of Bill Deeds. At one point she took 5 minutes off her campaign to yell at Dennis Healey's budget. Thus, despite the weight, literal and symbolic, of Whitelaw, Thatcher swept the second round easily, defeating the huge man by almost as huge a margin, 146 votes to 79, with Howe trailing in on 19. She was, of course, the first woman to lead a major British political party. And if you don't count Margaret Beckett and Harriet Harman's turns warming the seat for Labour, still the first of only 2. She was 49, the same age Heath had been when he took over, and which even now would be considered fairly young for a party leader, well apart from her groundbreaking ownership of the vagina. Things had changed. The future had arrived.
I'm not supposed to grant. All you've got to do is win. That's all you gotta do. All you have to do is win.
Meanwhile, in government, everything was destroyed at a gradual pace.
From the Mother of Parliaments come unexpected headlines.
An exhausted Harold Wilson took everyone by surprise by resigning with no warning at all in 1976. He was replaced with James Callaghan, his Foreign Secretary, previously Home Secretary and Chancellor, so no one could call him unqualified. What experience didn't stop him from being one of our worst prime ministers, however. And that's by his own estimation. Even he considered himself the worst prime minister of the 20th century. And that might be harsh, with Bonner Law, who died of throat cancer inside a year, and Ramsay MacDonald, who went from Nick Clegg 80 years early, but Callaghan is at least tied with Sir Anthony Eden for worst post-war 20th century Prime Minister. A debate on his very worst mistake could last for months without resolution. But from a historical and progressive perspective, the decision not to hold a general election prior to the Winter of Discontent must rank fairly high. In 1978, Labour were doing okay-ish. The malaise of the 70s looked like it might just be on the point of starting to consider lifting as the decade ended. Inflation was finally trickling downwards, not that it had anywhere else to go. It had one of the tiniest majorities of all time, from the second 1974 election, 3 measly seats, and had promptly pissed that away even before Callaghan took over, leaving them a minority government once more. Their insurance was what became known as the Lib-Lab Pact, an agreement on the Liberals' part to grit their teeth and vote with them if it ever came to no confidence, which it regularly did. In return for which, Labour agreed to maybe listen to the Liberals' ideas once in a while. It's the exact equivalent to the deal Theresa May struck with the DWP in 2017, with 2 major differences. Namely, it didn't cost the government £1 billion, and the Liberals aren't evil. Meanwhile, the hard-left, centre-left division that was about to tear the Labour Party apart was content while in power to simmer behind their little post-Wilson compromise, as long as he did exactly what he was told at all times. The party and the nation were balanced on a knife edge, but Labour still had a grip on the hilt. Just about. The Labour government's method of staving off the unions and taming inflation, which was practically feral by the time they regained office, was a high-stakes game of poker with reality itself. The main talking point, a maximum pay rise level of £5, was actually phase 4 of an extended strategy that they'd been working on ever since regaining office by the skin of their teeth in October of 1974. Shortly afterwards, inflation reached an insane peak of 26%. The then Wilson administration reacted by implementing an income policy, a voluntary cap on wage rises, agreed to by themselves and the Trades Union Congress, the Union of Unions. Usually this would require an Act of Parliament, but with such a tiny majority, they were never going to get it through. So the government got around it by signing a social contract with the TUC that confirmed that the policy would indeed be voluntary and therefore wouldn't need an act because it wasn't going to be enforced, but that the TUC member unions would do it anyway, strictly on their own account and because they decided upon it themselves. Essentially, the economy was being run on the honour system. This precarious situation actually managed to work at first. By the time Callaghan had succeeded Wilson, and lost the tiny majority in the process, inflation had dropped to 10%. The strategy was now in phase 3, phase 2 having been a slight tinkering of the original limit, and everyone was preparing for the incomes policy to be gradually phased out in favour of a return to free collective bargaining. Unfortunately, although Britain's inflation had gone down, global inflation went haywire in 1978, not calming down until 1982. So instead of the gradual relaxation of the incomes policy, phase 4 turned out to be the 5% limit, which broke the social contract they signed with the TUC. Distinctly unimpressed, the TUC voted almost unanimously to tell the government to eat it. So now it's late summer 1978. Literally everyone in the entire world expects Callaghan to call an election. Traditionally, British elections were called by the Prime Minister at his or her discretion. As long as it was on a Thursday and no more than 5 years after the last one, a Prime Minister could call an election whenever they damn chose. This was before the Tories under David Cameron opportunistically brought in fixed terms of 5 years and no less, unless they lose a no-confidence vote by a landslide, or the Queen intervenes. More often than not in those days, elections tended to come 4 years apart. Going the full 5 years tended to be a sign of a government on the back foot. Major in 1997, Gordon Brown in 2010. The last election had been in 1974, as of course had the one before that, and resulted in the minuscule majority for Harold Wilson, which had long since been pissed away to leave a slightly tottering minority government. As for the pact with the Liberals, well, that had fallen apart earlier in the summer. Despite this, however, the fact that they had brought inflation down a bit and tamed the unions, albeit by giving them everything they want, gave Labour a far from commanding but definitely actual lead in the polls. So naturally, everyone expected the Prime Minister to call the election for the autumn while he had something resembling initiative. On the 7th of September, after spending almost all of August stringing the Tories along, Callaghan finally addressed the nation. The expectation was that he was finally going to give a date for the election. Instead, he did this.
I shall not be calling for a general election at this time. Instead, I ask every one of you to carry on with the task of consolidating the improvement now taking place in our country's position. Let's see it through together.
And so the Prime Minister decides against a general election. Mrs. Thatcher doesn't like it.
The election was postponed until the spring, and the 5% limit was kept through the winter. Callaghan was gambling all his marbles on the 5% limit fixing the economy by the spring. And in so doing, he sealed his fate. Thatcher immediately accused him and his party of running scared, literally calling them chickens. And David Steele, who as Liberal leader was gritting his teeth and backing the Prime Minister just 6 months earlier, called it astounding. But Callaghan, at least at first, was undaunted. He'd sent a message with his Psych No Election broadcast. He and no one else was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The nation was in his care, and he, at that point at least, had their support. And the opposition could eat a bowl of piss. This sounds like hubris. It's only because that's exactly what it was. The same month saw the annual conference at the TUC, at which Callaghan, a few days before the announcement, enigmatically quoted the music hall number Waiting at the Church. At the time, it was just smug and faintly confusing. With hindsight, it's a man dancing on his own grave. At the same conference, the TUC overwhelmingly voted to tell him to stick the 5% limit up his arse once and for all. Callaghan simply reminded them that it was voluntary, just like the first 3 phases, although there would be heavy sanctions on anyone going above the limit, just to make sure. Inevitably, anyone who could afford to break it did. And then the winter came.
Deep in the pine forests of Europe lies some of the most grueling tests ever devised by man. Chambers that sear at 22 degrees above boiling point and can freeze to -40. Machines that shake, pull and stretch 200 times a second. All these tests of endurance were built by Ford to test the Ford Granada.
It was Ford that set the dominoes tumbling. Being, Ford, they were easily rich enough to sod the limit and take the kick in the balls. But they also had a fairly tasty government contract at the time. So they initially played ball and gave their workers a 5% rise and no more. Workers, however, were not fooled and immediately called a strike, the first of many that winter, effectively daring Ford UK's management to defy the British government. For 2 months, Ford were 57,000 people short. During that time, Vauxhall announced that they were taking the sanctions and giving their workers an 8.5% rise. After 2 months of drawn-out negotiations, Ford decided that if the strike went on much longer, it was going to do far more damage than the sanctions ever could. So the hell with it, we're giving you 17%, just go back to work, will you please go back to work? And on November the 22nd, 2 months to the day after the start of the strike, they did. This was a blow to the Labour government's authority, and not even the first one, because just as the Ford strike was getting started in late September, Labour had their annual conference, where the main part was upstaged by the militant tendency, an already notorious sect within Labour who despised anyone to the right of Lenin and dearly wished for Labour to just accept Trotsky as its lord and saviour. The infighting between militant and mainstream Labour would be a major factor in Thatcher's almost complete lack of opposition over the next decade. In the 1978 conference, those wacky far-left irritants introduced a motion to censure the government and demand that they immediately stop interfering in wage negotiations. It passed overwhelmingly, leaving Callaghan wiping several layers of yolk from his physog, and Thatcher scenting blood. A vote of no confidence in the government was held on November 9th, 5 weeks into the Ford strike, leaving Labour scrabbling for a new pact to save their skins after the Liberals had got bored and wandered off. This time Labour managed to strike a deal with the Ulster Unionists, of all people. Number makers in British affairs, but traditionally Tory supporters, and of course ideological cousins to the more extremist DUP of the present day. In exchange for constituency reforms that created a few extra seats in Northern Ireland, they abstained from the vote of no confidence, which helped Labour win the ballot by a mere 12 votes. That achieved and the constituency reform completed, the Ulster Unionists buggered off again. Labour had survived by the strata cornere with the skin of their teeth. Unfortunately, they soon almost wished they hadn't. The Ford strike had set the precedent. With their more than 3 times over the limit settlement imminent, the government and the TUC began negotiations again to try and find a compromise, to almost some avail. When Ford inevitably announced their settlement, the government had to respond, announcing heavy sanctions on them and 220 other companies, including Vauxhall, that had also gone over the odds. And this turned out to be a starting gun for the Confederation of British Industry, likely with much encouragement from the Conservative Party, to leap to its collective feet and challenge the legality of the sanctions. And this gave the Tories an in to propose a motion to get the sanctions reversed, which eventually passed by a handful of votes. And as if that wasn't enough humiliation, Callaghan then faced yet another no-confidence ballot. Although he survived again, this time by 10 votes, he had to concede defeat and withdraw the sanctions, which effectively left him and his government with their one big idea, the 5% limit, rendered completely impossible to actually enforce. Inevitably, chaos reigned. The first people to take advantage were the lorry drivers, and more pertinently, the oil tanker drivers. Happy New Year 1979, your resolution is to do less driving. Ports were picketed, barrels of petrol lay unguzzled, filling stations were forced to close. In the middle of it, Callaghan buggered off to Guadalupe for an international summit. That was easy enough to spin in the first place, but when he came back, he really shot himself in the foot. Some of his advisers tried to steer him away from the massive crowd of reporters who'd inevitably congregated to meet him upon his return, but others thought a returning PM giving a brief statement about tackling the unions would provide a strong image for the election, which was now unavoidably going to happen sometime this year. Unfortunately, when he showed up in Heathrow tanned, grinning from ear to ear and saying how nice it was to have taken a dip in the Caribbean, it wasn't exactly a PR victory. The fateful question was asked by the Evening Standard.
What is your general approach and view of the mounting chaos in the country at the moment?
Well, that's a judgment that you are making. I promise you that if you look at it from outside, and perhaps you're taking a rather parochial view at the moment, I don't think that other people in the world would share the view that there is mounting chaos. You know, we've had strikes before.
While the answer was none too bright to say the least, it was less callous and out of touch than history remembers, largely because history remembers it as the resultant headline in the following day's Sun. Not so much a paraphrase as an outright twisting. Callaghan's intention had been to play down the loaded language so as not to cause panic. Unfortunately, Keith Joseph, he said it extremely badly. Sufficiently badly that the Sun were able to turn it into a weapon to use against him. Soon everyone and their dog was walking out of their jobs. Train drivers, ambulance drivers, nurses. Bin men walked out for so long that local authorities had to dump their rubbish in the municipal parks, the most notable being Leicester Square, providing a nice iconic image for the whole crisis. Rats recolonised London. Even blacker than that, in Liverpool, the gravediggers walked out, leaving piles of corpses stored in Toxteth warehouses awaiting anything to happen. Fortunately, the gravediggers' strike only lasted 2 weeks, or things would have got even more nightmarish. The days of Ted Heath and his 3-day week suddenly looked like a golden age of prosperity. Under these circumstances, a box of wasps in a hat could have won the next election, assuming it ran against Labour. Finally, in late February, the government and the TUC hammered out a deal to send everyone back to work. But the damage was done. Before the winter, Labour had a lead in the polls of 5 points. By February, the Tories were ahead by 20. On the 28th of March, a long night ended with Labour finally, inevitably losing a no-confidence motion by a single vote, forcing Callaghan to call an election he had absolutely no chance in hell of winning. And all because he put off one which he had a slim but non-zero chance of winning. Throughout it all, Thatcher had barely had to do anything at all. In truth, she hadn't been a great leader of the opposition, alternately nervous and trying too hard. But with the government falling apart in front of her, all she had to do was show up and appear vaguely competent. To give her due, she managed that. Callaghan regretted not calling that 1978 election until the day he died, at 92 years of age in 2005. Britain's longest-lived Prime Minister, beating the similarly ancient Harold Macmillan by 39 days. Of the Winter of Discontent, he often told interviewers that he'd let the country down. And indeed he had. The country and his party, and even more than he at the time realised, because he helped make Thatcher Prime Minister. She should have got down on her knees and thanked him.
Tax on skill. Give our people incentives, and once again Britain will be back in the race.
All this talk of blood and iron